To kick off the Growing Young programme in Scotland, about 40 churches sent representatives together to a meeting in Kinross to hear more about what was involved in the programme and to consider whether it's something that their churches might want to take part in. Well, we know there's a lot of people that couldn't be here tonight and weren't able to take part, so we put together this short video to give you a flavour of some of the things that were discussed so that you can get some insight into what's involved in Growing Young.
I've had an interest in generational characteristics for a long time, really trying to work out how the church connects with folk of different generations. I've done talks on that in numerous different places, and that really has been a passion of mine, I guess, for the last 15 years or so, thinking, how does the church become multi-generational at a time when actually it looks like it's growing old? So that's been a real concern of mine for a long time. I took some study leave earlier in the year and read the Growing Young book, and I realised that their approach to things was slightly different to mine. So I'd been looking at generational characteristics and saying, how do you design a church that's going to be multi-generational? So I was doing the theory. They were actually going out and saying, where are the churches who are doing the business? And on the basis of that, they were then saying, these are the things that we see in the churches that are doing the business. And I actually looked at the 6 things they came up with, and they made perfect sense to me, given all that I knew about generational characteristics. So it was that sense of, I can sit and try and convince folk about designing the right thing, but actually here's some examples of what it means to be churches that are multi-generational, and here are some of the key factors. And so that kind of spoke to me. It was kind of, I think these are going to be key factors in Scotland. I don't think they're just in America. They chime in with all that I know about generational characteristics. And so that really piqued my interest and made me say, how do we use some of their learning here in Scotland?
Well, I think as a steering group, we recognised it was one thing to have an idea, to look at some material and think it worked. But if we genuinely wanted to run it in Scotland and to promote it, we needed to do a bit more research and find out for ourselves what the programme was really like. So we could talk for hours, but we won't. So just 3 snapshots. The first about the programme. First about the principles. If you look on your sheet, you'll see a pie chart which lists 6 principles. One of them is about giving young people responsibility. And as we looked at these in detail, we thought these make sense. So one example from that. Week after week, we came back from California. In our church, we had a 24-hour prayer for young people. And this had been arranged for some time. And I was speaking to Paul, who was the person who came up with the idea and who was running it. And I said, did we get the young people involved? And he said, yeah, we asked them for lots of ideas about what we should pray for. And then I looked at Paul and I said, in the light of having been to California and then talking about giving young people responsibility, and I said, did we ask the young people to be part of the praying? And we just looked at each other and realized our focus had been on doing things for young people instead of involving the young people in doing them. So the principles work. The second thing is the people. The people that we met who are behind Growing Young, and we'll see some of them on the screen in a moment, are very competent and very capable people. And I asked Cara, who's the head of Fuller Youth Institute, the question I asked her, but I did it more politely than this, was, what's in it for you? Why would you come to Scotland and run this programme? And she said, well, it's part of our vision and our commitment to equipping the church. But the other thing about it is we want to learn. So here are people who are experts, who are at the top of their game, and instead of being full of themselves, they're saying, we want to work in Scotland because working in a different culture with young people and the churches there, we would learn. And we were really struck by the combination of competence and humility. And the third thing is the programme itself. We haven't got time to go into it in detail, but it's a programme that lasts for a year. And you'll know, as I know, that in Kirk sessions, it's easy for people to be enthusiastic. Great idea, we should really do something about it, and nothing happens. We have a problem with finding a way to implement the things we want to do. And I think one of the things that they have managed to do is to create a program with different things happening over 10 months that really mean that the things that we want to do, we will do.
but it was this sense that actually I can see that the method that they're using of deliberately drawing together a number of folk from the congregation, not just the minister, but bringing together a group of folk to say what we're going to do back at home, then going back to do it, and then coming back and thinking about it again, and somebody walking the journey with you. I've seen that work in other places. And it was kind of, so here's some principles around, but here's also a modus operandi that actually, for me, seems to work. So
I'm Brad, and this is Jake. We work together with the Fuller Youth Institute, but actually, geographically, we're not in the same place right now. And so that's why we're on two different screens. But I want to share a little bit about kind of how we got into this and how we started this journey, and give you a sense for where we've been. And we really started with this question, and a question that I think all of us, I mean, it's probably why you're in this room today. What does the future of the church look like? And not just that, but what does the future of your church look like? What does the future of our church look like? And just on a really, really personal level, what's going to happen to my church? What's going to happen to my church after my leadership is done here? But not just that, but a few years from now. And a lot of us are looking around in our congregations and asking that question. And we know that question is a little bit different in the Scottish context than here in the US context, but we want to share some of kind of what got our attention and what's been getting more attention of pastors, ministers, and leaders here in the US, and why we started down this road of asking these questions together. And so a few statistics to get us there from kind of a 30,000-foot view, in part because of this leadership maxim, the first job of leaders is to define reality. We think if we're going to be faithful leaders, we need to, from time to time, get up above things and define what's the reality, what's going on right now, and how can that open us up to what God might be doing. So some of that reality in our context for the past dozen years or so, that about 1 out of 2 young people who grow up in church contexts here in the US drift from God and the church with something that kind of opened our eyes and even began to drive our research agenda at the Fuller Youth Institute about a dozen years ago, led to a project that we called Sticky Faith, looking at what factors contribute to maybe helping faith stick across that transition. But then we began to dig deeper, because some of the other realities, about 2/3 of young people drop out between ages 18 to 23. Some other research found that in our context. No major Christian tradition is growing in the US right now. There's a very real decline in most churches. Religious nuns are on the rise, those who choose no affiliation with any particular religious tradition. And you can see that increase over the past 10-year period, and this is a recent statistic actually increased that increase. This is a newer phenomenon here in the US, and we realize that you all are a few years ahead of us on this, but this has been kind of our wake-up call, the church's wake-up call to pay more attention to what's going on. Our friend and colleague Scott Cormode, who is a leadership expert and studies change in churches, he has said, perhaps the church is calibrated for a world that doesn't exist. That a lot of our churches and our structures and our ministries, in particular our ministries to young people, but also just our ways of doing church, they were created for a world that we're no longer in. They were created with a world with different assumptions, a society with different assumptions about the role of the church, the role of faith, the role of this community. And we need to rethink those assumptions and maybe recalibrate the church. Now, that's a whole lot of bad news. And we realize that you're kind of living with and processing some bad news of your own, and what that means for the church broadly, Church of Scotland, and then also your individual congregations. But we didn't want to stick there. We also kind of had this hunch that maybe that's not the whole story. That maybe God's not done with the church. That maybe our conviction that the church is God's idea. The church is God's answer. The church is still how God wants to deliver the good news of Jesus Christ to the world today. And if that's true, then there's got to be more to the story. And there's got to be more that's going on in churches. And so we set out to really uncover some of those stories, to discover what's going well. What can we learn from churches who really are engaging young people, from churches who are not just shrinking and declining, from churches where young people want to be part. They want to call home. So we set out to do that. So our research really was in pursuit of this question. What's happening in churches that aren't shrinking and aging, but they're growing in involving and retaining young people, specifically ages 15 to 29, but also broader than that. And in particular, how that brings health and vitality to the whole church. Along the way, we found that what we call growing young, this increase in participation and vitality, this isn't just about changing youth ministry. We can't just tack this on to something that we do with youth or even with young adults, but it really is about church culture. And so I'm going to share a few of our findings, and then Jake is going to unpack a little bit about how we're trying to get at that culture change piece, and what Graham and Neil are hoping that we can, perhaps that you can engage in your own context on this. So out of our research, as we kind of poured through over 1,300 interviews and 10,000 hours of research data, we distilled these, what we call 6 core commitments that kind of hold together. And we organize them together in a wheel, and I think you have some familiarity with that, and I don't want to unpack this whole wheel for us. But I do want to talk about just a few of the core commitments as an example of kind of some ways in. So we're trying to take these learnings from churches and then help churches apply them to their own context. A couple of assumptions here. One is that being a Jesus-centered community is at the core of what it means to grow young, that our pursuit isn't young people, our pursuit is Jesus Christ and his church and a way of life together in the name of Jesus. So we don't ever want to idolize young people or pursue them for their own sake. We want to do that because we're trying to be faithful to what God's calling us to in Jesus. And then the second assumption is that context is everything. And so, I think this is going to feature a lot into our conversations together. And we say that here in the US-based context, that community to community, church to church, that the context looks a little different and needs to drive how we apply these, how we live out these core commitments, and how we pursue them together as we're trying to discern how to be faithful. So I want to talk about just a few commitments, and then I'm going to hand over to Jay. One of these transformative commitments that we see churches living out is empathizing with today's young people. And when we think about empathy across generations, I don't know if this is as true in your Scottish context, but here in the US, we have a real empathy gap. And right now in particular, across generations, we have a lot of trouble just understanding each other and relating to each other. So we resort a lot to labels. And, if you think about labels that kind of get slapped on generations, we hear a lot of labels. We hear labels like lazy and entitled, often referring to a whole generation of young people. We hear about, the millennials. Now, what's interesting is, the millennials are now in their 20s and 30s. And we have this whole other new, younger generation of emerging kids and teenagers who they don't want to fit any of those labels, but neither do millennials, really. And if we're honest and we step back, none of us really like to be labeled by our generation. Labels don't really get us to empathy. What gets us to empathy is listening in real relationships and seeking out understanding. And so we talk about not judging, withholding our judging, but being willing to journey with the young people in front of us, to listen to their stories, to understand their perspectives, and to get a sense for what's driving the way that they understand church. I was really moved by the Catholic Church as an example here, actually, in this past year or so. Last year, they gathered an international group to ask questions about what's going on with young people globally in the Catholic Church. And I think we could all learn from that. Pope Francis put out this statement in response. He said, "We have the opportunity, the task, and the duty to be a sign of a church that really listens and that allows herself to be questioned by the experiences of those she meets and not always have a ready-made answer." That sounds a lot like empathy to us. And sounds a lot like what these churches who are being effective with young people are really putting into practice. I want to share a couple more. Related to empathy is warmth. Now, it was so fascinating to us. We kind of had a hunch going in that relationships and authenticity would be important to young people in our research. What continued to surprise us over and over was how much that relational warmth really, really mattered. And in fact, of all the phrases we heard people describe their church, this phrase, like family, is one that kept bubbling to the top over and over and over. This place is like a family. These people are my family. This feels like home. And that was a really, really important recurrent theme to us. That we feel like, gosh, that just sounds like healthy church. But there are so many barriers to warmth. Empathy is one of those barriers. But our structures, sometimes our ways of being together are also barriers. In these healthy, thriving churches, we began to hear these cluster of terms that we began to kind of put together and talk about as warmth, this welcoming and accepting and belonging and authenticity. And these tended to be really, really important and actually embodied in real people who live out that kind of warmth. You know, when I think about my own kids, I have 3 kids. They're all preteens and teenagers right now. And when they talk about our church, they talk about the people who matter to them, who've listened to them, who know their stories, who are interested in what they're involved in, and who, as one of my kids would say, you know, they really get me. They really get me. And I think that's what warmth is. It's being seen and known and heard. And welcome like family. The last priority I want to talk about before Jake shares a bit about how we get into change is prioritizing young people everywhere. Now, I gotta say, a lot of us have theories that we prioritize young people. We saw this in a number of churches, and I want to share one story in particular about a church that went from kind of prioritizing in theory to actually prioritizing in reality. And it was a church it was a bilingual congregation. They are a predominantly immigrant congregation, Spanish-speaking, from Mexico and Central America, and here in the Los Angeles area. And this congregation, they were worshiping 100% in Spanish, but they began to realize that a lot of their young people were kind of becoming disconnected from worship and disconnected from their church. And they realized that this is because their young people, that second generation, they live in an in-between space. And it's in between cultures, and it's in between language. And at home and at church, they would be speaking in Spanish, and then at school and in their social spaces, they were speaking English. And they realized that, you know, if we really want to stay connected to the young people in front of us, we need to be open to worshiping and teaching and community life that also involves English, because English is also the heart language of our young people. And this older generation was actually willing to sacrifice something very, very important to them and make room. And so today, I mean, when we visited this church, they had made some incremental changes, but about a third of the worship service, the song, the prayer, was done in English. And so they would switch back and forth between English and Spanish. And it was a way of making room, of actually being hospitable to young people, creating space. And as a result, we saw a lot of young adults and teenagers in leadership. They were part of leading music and worship. They were praying. And there was this ability for them to kind of be seen and heard. That's what it looks like to prioritize young people. It's not just rhetoric, but it's actually putting that rhetoric in action and prioritizing young people across the life of the church. And we found that this actually can be a hinge point for churches, where if they fail to prioritize young people, they actually tend to kind of get off of this wheel and into that curve of growing old. On this front, we believe, and a pastor told us, everyone rises when we focus on young people. And there's an image of a pie here, because we think about sometimes prioritization is like giving a bigger slice of the pie. And there's often a fear that if we give a bigger slice of the pie to young people, someone else is going to miss out. And as we explored that in churches, we learned that no, actually, if we give a bigger slice of priority to young people, that the whole pie gets bigger. No one else misses out, but actually the whole church grows in energy, in vitality, in ideas. And we saw that play out over and over again, and it really kind of re-inspired us and our own conviction that prioritizing young people is more than just saying we're going to focus on youth ministry or we're going to create some program for young adults, but it's actually asking the question across the whole life of our church, what would it look like for us to consider young people, to make room for them, and to really listen and even let them lead and have a load-bearing role in our community. That, I'm sure, raises all kinds of questions. It's kind of a blitz through some of the content around growing young. So I'm going to hand off to Jake here about what it looks like to really contextually apply this and to make it real, to give it flesh and bones in our community. So Jake, I'm gonna hand over to you.
Brad started us out with the content and some of the backbone of what we walked through within the Growing Young cohort. I have a few questions that I think came in early from Neil and Graham and their conversations that I want to respond to in terms of next steps and what those next steps might look like. So I'll do that in the next 6-7 minutes here. The first one was this: why did we set up these cohorts and how do they work? And a phrase that we use during the training, we think that this process of growing young, it's not primarily about changing youth ministry. We think that this process, as Brad began with, is very much about changing church culture. And I don't know about in Scotland, but at least the way that church culture changes in the United States is slowly. Can I get an amen to that from anyone in Scotland?
Amen.
Okay, Neil, Graham, at least I see the two of you with your hands up. An analogy that we have found helpful is the difference between a microwave and a slow cooker. Now, do you call it a slow cooker in Scotland, or what would be the term that you would use?
Yeah.
Okay, slow cooker works. So a microwave is great for several things, perhaps reheating a piece of pizza or a piece of whatever is your choice of meat, making popcorn, as we would say. What a microwave is not as good for is when you want to really bring together a set of flavors and help them cook and marinate over a longer period of time. And we think that often for churches, we think this is true not only in the US, and I'll say shame on us in some ways because many American churches popularize models that are not very helpful or effective and then sent them externally. But often our approach to change in the church is more of a microwave approach to change. We change this very quickly and it's effective for a short period of time. To bring that back to our cohort in the slow cooker, what we've seen is if we really want to help our churches grow young, if we really want to shape and disciple young people, and in fact all people in more effective ways, what we need to do is to create the right sort of environment. We need to create the right sort of culture. We need to pursue that change in a disciplined and consistent manner. We need to slowly raise that temperature. And what we found is we need a cohort to do that, because as much as we would love to, we can't just invite a group of people together, have one inspirational message, every person's life has changed, and then we go back and the church is different. We've seen that churches change slowly and over time, which is part of the reason we designed the cohort process. Another question that came out along those lines, how do we make sure this is rooted in a Scottish context and relevant for Scotland? We very much view this cohort process as a two-way conversation. So it is not us coming in and saying this is everything that's going to happen along the way. We're going to come in with a set of best practices that have been used with, yes, about 500 churches within the United States. We've been doing this for several years. We've also used this in other contexts outside of the United States, including Australia. And we will approach it with, here's what we're doing in a US context. We are experts in a US context, and we are experts in understanding young people. We're not experts in Australia. We're not experts in Scotland. We're not experts in your context, but you are. So what we very much want to do is have that be a two-way conversation. So we anticipate that Graham and Neil would be very involved in building what the process looks like, as well as others you might choose. Another piece of this is, as part of the Growing Young cohort, every church is assigned a coach. Those coaches will be Scottish coaches. We will provide some training, we will get them up to speed on the materials, but those who are actually walking with your churches day in and day out are those who understand a Scottish context. What does the cohort look like in practice? There are these 2 summit gatherings, so those are the in-person training events that both last a couple of days each. But then there's the coaching that I mentioned. We have an assessment tool that will help your church understand its relative strengths and weaknesses. And then from there, what we're really helping you to do is build a team within your church who can tackle some of these issues, challenges, and opportunities. That team walks through a listening process where it better understands your unique culture, your unique young people, your unique community. And then we will help you move forward with experiments and other next steps that begin to change your culture. The next question I had received was, how do we see this working out in a Scottish context? Okay, how will we see this working out in a Scottish context? And how do we make sure it's really contextualized to Scotland? Neil and Graham have already sent us some great work, including Neil's church leadership paper, Ambivalence About Leadership. So we will be digging into resources that you all provide. I don't know if I'm going to pronounce his name right, but Steve, is it pronounced Aesthorpe, who wrote Invisible Church?
Yep.
Okay, I think I see Neil nodding, or Graham nodding. So we are going to be digging into your resources to better understand your context. But a piece that I'll bring in is with those 6 core commitments that Brad shared, we don't see those just being American principles. We actually see those being biblical principles about the church. And if you're not sure you follow what I'm saying there, I would invite you, if you go back and look at Acts chapter 2, and if you look at a picture of the early church in Acts chapter 2, we think that there is, it's not a one-to-one mapping, but there is quite a lot of alignment between, we see an early church that is absolutely focused on Jesus, that is empowering Jesus' disciples, who we have every reason to believe were a younger group of people. These are a group of people who are being good neighbors in their community. Yes, they're yes, they're going to the temple, but they're also sharing time in each other's homes, praying together. That aligns well with the sense of warm community. So to say that in another way, when we researched American congregations and pulled out the principles of what they focus on, what we found was not just these brand new, unique things that no one has ever thought of. In many ways, it drove us back to the idea of what we think Scripture talks about the church is designed to look like. So that's one piece I would say. The next piece I would say, Brad and I, we are researchers. We would like to think that we approach things with intellectual humility. And if we needed any additional reason to be humble as Americans, our recent government has given us an opportunity to do that over the last several years. We recognize that this era of exporting things from the US to other places, first of all, was never a great idea. Even more, I think we're aware of the we need each other and the two-way give and take. I won't get into politics any more than that, but I'm going to judge by the laughter in the room. You get what I'm saying. So the last piece that I want to respond to is what has the impact of this training been, and really what can you expect for churches in Scotland to be able to go through this? So I'm going to talk about short-term and long-term. I'll wrap this up in the next minute or two so that I know we can go to our table discussions. In the short term, and we've had about 500 churches within the US who have been through this over the past 5 or so years, so we've really got some time to look at. In the short term, we think that you are going to, if you were to participate in this training, we think it's possible to have really good ideas that come about that give you a sense of hope for the future. We think it's possible that you are going to launch and see very successful experiments in the short term. We think that you can have a plan for where things are going to go in the short term, that you will see increased connection between generations in the short term, that you're going to have this sense that you are being more faithful to Jesus and the gospel in the short term. I need to balance that out by saying we are not promising overnight success with this training. We just want to be really honest about that from the beginning. While we think that you can make initial steps that are going to be helpful and successful, we think the way that church culture changes is slowly. We think in a 1 to 3 year period, you can see very substantive changes in your overall church culture, but it will take time. We think it is possible to have an increased number of young people who are part of your congregation. We are not going to help you get as many young people as fast as you can get them, because that often is not the deeper, more robust, substantive approach that we need to really ask the deep questions about who are the young people around us and what sort of churches do we need. Here's one of my stories that I'll share from a church on what I think you can expect. There was a church involved in our research called Volga Christian Reformed Church. This was a rural congregation in South Dakota in the United States. I don't know if you know much about South Dakota. There's a lot of room there. This is a rural congregation of about 80 people. And in this congregation, what they wanted, and this is one that actually showed up within our research, there was a youth leader, her name was Vonda. Vonda was in her 60s. Vonda desperately wanted to see the young people in the church, the teenagers specifically, form a youth praise band. Vonda's peers told her, there will never be a day where teenagers lead worship in our services. They liked robes, they liked hymns, they liked things how they had always been. Well, what ended up happening is Vonda respected the wishes of her congregation and her peers, and she said, okay, we'll take this slowly. And what would happen is on Sundays, after the church service was done, the whole church would end up going outside and they would have sort of a picnic together. Well, what Vonda did is she took the teenagers downstairs in the church basement and said, we're not gonna disobey what people said, and we're not gonna lead worship upstairs, but we will practice worship down in the basement. The first time they did that, a few people heard what they were doing. They went inside, kind of weren't sure what was happening. They saw that the teenagers were down in the basement, not leading worship upstairs, and said, all right, I think that's okay since they're leading in the basement. A couple weeks later, the teenagers continued to practice in the basement. And a couple of the senior adults in the church decided to check out what they were doing. A couple weeks later, those senior adults decided to take a few friends and watch the teenagers rehearse their worship. A few weeks later, it became this normal trend in the congregation where they would have the adult worship service upstairs, and then the whole church would go downstairs and watch the youth praise band play a couple of songs. About 3 months went by, and one of the people in the church who was most opposed to the teenagers leading worship in the service went to Vonda and said, Vonda, it is not fair that you keep these teenagers leading worship in the basement. Why don't we invite them upstairs and let them lead one of the worship songs? Here's what Vonda said. She turned to her friend and said, I've never thought about that. That's a wonderful idea. Lead a song in the main service. What started as one worship song over months became 2, over months became 3. Taking that change over a 2 to 3 year period, this is a church where generations are integrated, where they care for each other. It started with very small intentional cultural shifts and trusting where the Holy Spirit was leading. So we do think that sort of change is possible. We think that's possible for any church, for a church in Scotland, church in the States. I think I've exceeded my time, so I will pause there so that we can go to group discussions, and Brad and I will wait for further questions.
This is what Fuller put up when they were announcing that they were going to be using the Growing Young programme, announcing a new project helping young people discover and love your church. And one of the dangers of reading that is that you think somebody's got a nice new marketing ploy, and actually if we just introduce their marketing ploy, then young folk will love the church in a way that they haven't in the past, and actually that would be to totally misrepresent what they're saying. Because what they're actually talking about is changing church culture. Not changing young folk so that they love the church, but actually saying we need to be about the changes in the church and engaging with young folk so that actually we begin to see that they engage fully and find that it is family for them and a place of belonging. And so it is about travelling together on a journey of change that is about our churches. You take us on a slide. These are the folk that we met when we were out in Fuller, and a real mixed bag of folk from a whole lot of different churches. Some of the folk that we met were saying our families are only coming 1 week out of 3. One of the churches we visited, 40% of the churches that came to their youth program were from unchurched background. We seem to sometimes have this kind of view that things in the States are, so different, so rosy, so bright. And actually what we saw was the reality was very different, and the things that we face, they're facing. So although Brad and Jake are saying we don't understand your culture, there is much of the culture that's developing there that they would see in Scotland. One of the things to say very clearly is, you take us on one, we have no blueprint ready. If you've not picked that up this evening, let me be crystal clear about that. We are not saying, come on a program, we'll tell you exactly what to do, just follow this blueprint and it will all work and it will all happen. Next slide is a quote from an article that was written in 2017 just about leadership. And this article said, we build on the work of Marianne and Yuhai Bien. We suggest that in complex system, leaders enable rather than control the future. And ministers often are brought in on the basis of, we've got a problem here, you must know how to solve us, tell us what to do and we will do it. And actually, all the stuff that's been written now, in all kinds of contexts, is actually saying, actually, it doesn't work that way. And that system is broken down. They take us on. It says, the way the future is birthed is not like it used to be. We used to measure, then plan, then implement. Not anymore. The speed of change and the interconnectivity of the world have changed all that. Now what we do is create prototypes. We do some experimenting. A prototype models our current best understanding of the process or goal to enable an iterative adaptation to a new environment. We have to begin before we are ready. Now, that is where we are as a church in Scotland at the moment. Actually, we're looking at it going, we're in a new environment and we don't know how to cope with this. We've never been this way before, is one of the quotes. So how do we actually begin to do this? And the writers of this article are saying, well, in any sphere, what folk do is they form a prototype. They say, well, let's do this and let's see if that works. And if that doesn't work, then what else do we do? So in a sense, if you take us on one, we're inviting you to be involved in building prototype models of church fit for the 21st century in Scotland. That's what this process is about. It's saying, can we actually deliberately together help each other in this process? Not just you in your small corner and I in mine, but how do we travel this journey together? How do we learn from one another? How do I hear the stories of what you're doing and you hear the stories of what I'm doing? I hear the stories of what Martin's doing in Arbroath. How do we draw these things together so that actually we begin to build something that is good and right? And improving those that already exist. Ross came up and put on the chart up there, this works in Scotland, because in Gorebridge, they would recognise that these 6 principles are being worked out in the church in Gorebridge, and about a third of their congregation, maybe more than that on a Sunday morning, are teenagers. So you might look at it and say, do these principles work in Scotland? And Ross would say, well, they work in Gorebridge. And Gorebridge is a working class parish in Midlothian. It's kind of, these things are universal. That's what Brad and Jake said. And actually, we see it working out in at least one church in Scotland. There will be others as well. Tony's on the end of this, and we know that Tony in Bankery also has got a multi-generational church. One of the things we discovered, one of the churches we visited when we were out there was a church that was already multi-generational in a sense, and we said to them, so was there any value in you being part of the process? Because they already seemed so far on. And they said, oh yes. This has really helped us focus and move on the next step. It's about incremental steps, and no matter where we start, it's about making the next bit of the journey and travelling together well. The next slide, Certainly this is where we are with things. We're saying that we would like to run a cohort with 24 congregations. That's the kind of size that they've been running in Fuller. We need that kind of size to make it stack up in terms of finances. There will need to be a commitment from the minister in the Kirk session. If either the minister or the Kirk session is saying this is not for us, then it's not for you. There needs to be that level of commitment. And we'll need £1,000 from each congregation. That would be the cost of what's there. We're not used to paying for things in the Church of Scotland. Usually it's all provided centrally. But actually, this is not being provided centrally. So we're hoping that congregations will pay £1,000 and that we will be able to persuade your presbytery to support you in that process by also perhaps giving you £1,000 off your mission and ministry so that you might take part. There's a series of 5 webinars, there's 2 overnight summits, there's 2 coaching calls. Half the way through the process, you're beginning to draw folk together in a coaching network. So the coach draws together the 4 or 5 churches that they've got and begins to work with them. There is something almost every month that is actually checking in with you and saying, how are you doing in this? How can we support you in this? What are you learning from this? From September all the way through to the August. Now, you've got questions about what happens out the other side. Yes, undoubtedly, we need to begin to think about that. But this is a process that's set out. This is why Jake was saying we think we've got a process that will give you a good kickstart, because all of this will take you through that. So webinars, summits, all of those that are there. Take us on to the early work. Early work in the process is about developing a transformation plan, but it is an incremental thing. If you take us on one, there's one of the folk who was there, a senior pastor in a church we visited, said, actually what I've been teaching my people is that it moves a cog at a time. It's incremental change. And sometimes those incremental changes seem like so insignificant, but that's all it is. It's just a bit at a time. So actually the starting point is less important than the willingness to take those incremental steps. So developing a church transformation plan, you take us on one. The next part would be actually a key element, and that is listening. When we shared in the cohort with folk went away knowing that they needed to listen. Most conferences I've gone to, folk have stood at the front, they've said, here's what you've got to do, you've now got the answers, go back and implement them in your church. Yep. Actually, that's not what they were saying. They were saying you need to go back and listen. Because you need to understand your context, you need to understand the young people in your area, you need to listen. A key part of the process that's there. 6 months in, I take us on a slide. At the February summit, it's about evaluating progress, it's about refining plans. The coaching networks would be formed at that basis. And March to August, there's then more work on implementation. I say just a bit about the summits. If you take us on a slide, they would be on a Friday and Saturday. We recognise that that means that some folk are probably going to have to take a Friday off work. We were told that folk would take 2 days off work to come and do that. Most of the time it's kind of in the States, it's usually staff in churches. We don't have that in Scotland, but it does need a bit of time away. So we're looking at doing that. Take us on a couple of clicks. We would like to do that as a residential, but the honest truth is that we don't have the funds for that at the moment. We were hoping that the growth fund of the church nationally might have been something we could tap into, but it's not ready yet. And therefore, we're saying at the moment we don't think we're able to do that. We may use a conference centre in Perth or Dunfermline. You take us on a click, or we may use church premises. If you're interested, what should you do? Well, register your interest now would be the first thing. The second thing would be to book a visit to your Kirk session in January, February. The team who are working with you tonight, we would come to your Kirk session. You would apply by Friday the 24th of March, and then decisions about who would be involved will be made by April, giving you May and June to do some preparatory work before we would launch after the summer. So that's the programme we're working to at the moment, and much of that is set out on the frequently answered questions that you've got. That's where you need to check what's there. I set up a Facebook page today. First time I've ever set up a Facebook page. That's shocking, isn't it? So there's a Facebook page, Growing Young Scotland. The frequently asked questions are there. If you want to ask questions, just put them, please, onto there. We will try to answer those. We are recording tonight so that we can actually put a video together, a 6-7 minute video that you'll be able to show to people, and that will be up on YouTube hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and we will let you know about that as well. So that's where we are with stuff. There are some questions that were there that I think were more for us than they were for Brad and Jake. So we're going to try and pick up some of those just now. You've been looking over this.
So some of the people are obviously thinking about some of the details which Graham has just said. For example, why does the minister have to be involved? We visited a couple of churches. We visited a couple of churches in the California area who had done this. One of the churches, the senior pastor was not involved. The senior pastor said, yeah, this is a good idea, but didn't get involved. And it was quite significant in speaking to the senior youth worker in that church that Growing Young hadn't really embedded in their congregation. And we in our knowledge of the way that the Church of Scotland works means that the minister is a key person. And if the minister, it's not enough for the minister to be saying, this is a good idea. The minister has to be bought on, committed, part of it, working as part of the team. They don't have to be the main driver, but they need to be one of the 4 people who's prepared to commit that time and that effort. Otherwise, we don't think it will work. Another detail that Graham just mentioned is the Friday, Saturday. That's going to be a sacrifice for some people. But this program is about sacrifice. We're not going to become the kind of church that is going to grow young unless we're willing to make sacrifices at all kinds of levels. So £1,000, that's going to be difficult. Taking Friday, Saturdays, that may be difficult for some people. But actually, in terms of some of the sacrifices that we're going to be asking our congregations to make in order to change, that's going to be small beer. So it's worth actually noting that at the beginning and saying, yes, sacrifice is part of what we're talking about, and there are some that we will need to make.
Yep, there was one around, if God gives us faith, why are we having to target 18 to 30? Why do they drift? I think there is some stuff, the easy thing to do is actually to say it's their fault. And actually not to face the challenge about, how do we do stuff? I was sharing with folk earlier today that the Boys Brigade movement was birthed at a time when young boys weren't engaging with Sunday school. And so Smith said at that stage, what do I have to do to engage young people? Because I want them to learn about what it means to follow Jesus and be disciples of his. So, well, they're all going to things where they're marching. How about if I do something where there's a bit of marching? And that's how Boys Brigade was birthed. And you think, actually, this kind of stuff has been done throughout the history of the church, that we've looked at different generations and said, we're not reaching that generation in the way that we would want to. How do we speak God's truth into their lives so that they might respond to that? We cannot dictate the response, but we sure can make sure that we speak the message. And so there's that responsibility in us to shape things in a way that's right, recognizing that actually the fruitfulness of what we do will come because God works in folks' hearts and lives. But we need to play our part, and that would be our clear understanding.
Somebody was asking about young people being very transient. So sure, you might be able to create a culture that is where people are young, but then they're going to move. They're going to move. And actually, in the particular context that we're in North Berwick, we find that the bulk of our young people leave the town when they're 18. So we are working with that very thing. But what we recognize is that when not necessarily them, but their peers come back in their 30s and move into the town with children, they're not coming to our church. So it may be that in addressing these things so that we become more an atmosphere where younger people are more likely to want to be part of church, it's not that the people who are growing up in our church will remain with it, but it will be the sort of community where their peers who come to live in the town will want to be there.
Yeah, There's perhaps just two more, and then we're going to move on to allow you a bit of time. How does this programme apply to 30-40s if there are very few 20s to 30s? I actually think the principles that are there in Growing Young are actually true for all generations. One of the things around empathy that they talk about is actually that young people are looking about their own identity and belonging and purpose. I don't think young people just struggle with that. You know, what happens when you retire? What are the issues about? What's my identity? I'm no longer, you know, when somebody says, what do you do? I'm no longer able to say, well, I used to be, I'm not. Where do I belong? What's my purpose? So actually, when you begin to, I think that's part of the reason why when you look at what's there and they say, actually, this benefits the whole church, that when you begin to look at that, you go, actually, no, I can see how actually they're forcing us to ask the real questions of life. And so I think there is something around all of that, but we would particularly be looking at, I think, younger people. There is a question for me about whether we need to push the bottom age range down, because our problem in Scotland is that we lose children much younger than they lose them in the States. So that's going to be part of the contextualising for us, which will be saying, actually, our problem is slightly more nuanced, so it's not just a straight, but actually we've got difficulties even holding them until they get to secondary school. So how do we respond to all of that? That will be part of the contextualising of things, rather than just it's a cookie cutter and we can take it and bring it across here. Those are part of the conversations that we'll be having with Brad and Jake as we move through. So I think that's those two questions covered, and I think I'm going to hand over to Peter, who's just going to introduce our discussion time now. And we've almost caught up time.
Good, I'm Peter Wood, I'm a member of the steering group, and I was thrilled when Graham asked me to be part of this, because it's asking really important questions of the church and in our generation. And I hope that you're excited by what we've been listening to and thinking about this evening. You've done really well. I'm really impressed with your concentration. So do you want to just take a moment to stretch? Because just your concentration and listening have been brilliant. I've just been watching that. Just take a second just to stretch. Just a second, because we've got nearly finished. I didn't say you had to speak, because you're going to do that in a minute. Now, what about you? You've heard the input from the States. We've heard the framework for this learning community. The opportunities lie ahead of you. Where are you at in your place? How does this fit with where you're at in your church culture, at the stage, the season you're at in the life of your church? And what hurdles do you need to negotiate before you start this? Is this the right time? It's tempting to say yes, but we've asked to be honest about where we are and to identify things and to work together to say, maybe not this time, but next time, or it makes us think of something else. We want to engage with 24 congregations across Scotland who know what they're up for and can see that God's in this and things have come together for that. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to say, in your churches, in your pews, in your line, to say, is this the best fit for us at the moment where we are? What do we need to navigate so that we are well prepared to embrace this wholeheartedly as a church, as a whole church? Two questions. Is this a fit for us now? What do we need to navigate so that we embrace this with our whole heart?